Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're in the message to the church at Philadelphia, so that's Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 through 13. Last week we handed out some notes, so if you have those notes, actually it's 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? Time flies. All right, so and I have a little thing here that's supposed to put up some charts and stuff like that we're going to talk about. Anyhow, if you do not have notes from last time, we do have a few spare, so Charles has them to hand out. Some over here and over there. No, Paul, you don't get two. Okay, here's kind of the plan for today. We got about halfway through the passage last time. I would like to basically go through the entire passage and then kind of step back to the problem that verse 10 brings out. And we'll spend, I want to make sure we have time enough to get through the passage as a whole, but there's also, I think, some questions about verse 10 and the application of that to our present time. In fact, that's the basic question before us, is the promise that is made in verse 10 to this church at Philadelphia, does that promise have potential application to us today? And along those lines, something you can be thinking about. This church, the church that this promise was made to, was made 2,000 years ago. Where are those believers that were part of this church today? They're all dead. They're all gone. Hopefully they're with Christ, right? Okay. So can a promise that was made specifically to this church almost 2,000 years ago and the believers of that church, can it have application to us today? So that's the question we want to deal with, and hopefully we'll have time to get through that. And I see George smiling over here, okay? All right? And one of the things you can be thinking about is when this was written, okay, it was all written as one book. So I'm basically assuming that the first 3 chapters were attached to the remaining chapters from 4 on, all the way to the end of the book, and that as this was taken from church to church to church, okay, that the contents of all of this was read in those churches, all right? So that when in verse 10, when it talks about keeping them from the hour of trial, which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth, right, that's looking forward into the rest of the contents of this book, all right? And so the other question before us then is, if you were one of those people in the church of Philadelphia receiving this letter and thinking about the entire contents of that letter, how would you take that promise there in verse 10? Okay, so be thinking about that, all right? All right, so we're going to jump back here, do a little bit of review. We talked some about the church of Philadelphia, where it was located, and this was kind of at the end of a very fertile valley. It was located on a trade route that would have offered access into what they would call the Upper Anatolian Plateau in Asia Minor, or what we call Turkey today. So there was opportunity there for the gospel to be spread into different regions. And we talked about, I tried to lay out 4 basic views of how to interpret Revelation. The first of those was the non-literal or allegorical method. And let's see here. Let's see if it works. Okay, yeah, here we go. So these are some definitions here of each one of these views. Non-literal or allegorical method of interpretation. Basically, allegory looks beyond the plain, simple meaning of the text and looks for meaning behind that. Okay? To me, allegory often seems kind of like what you might call stream of consciousness, where maybe just one word or one idea can trigger off something else that may seem not all that related to what you see there on the surface. I was trying to think of an illustration. There is a scriptural illustration in Galatians chapter 4 when Paul uses kind of an allegorical interpretation to talk about the Old Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem. The only thing I could come up with is maybe a pastor standing up and he's preaching through the book of Revelation and he's talking about the dedication and the faithfulness of the saints. And he uses that to bring home a point of you need to be faithful to contribute to the church building program. Okay? I'm not sure that's exactly allegory, but you can kind of see how it goes beyond the obvious simple meaning of the text. Okay? The preterist view. Let's get that one up here. All right. So in the preterist view, that's fairly common among many Christians today. One of the proponents of this is a name you might be familiar with. I'll throw out a name. I'm doing this not to ridicule anybody or something like that, but Hank Hanegraaff, I believe, is a promoter of the preterist view. And this view sees Revelation as basically a book of symbolic pictures that symbolize the conflicts that the church faces. But it's primarily focused on what the church faced at the time of Rome, at the time of the writing of this here, okay? So most preterists tend to interpret the book within the context of that Roman period, okay? And it's by and large interpreted either symbolically or allegorically, and it sets forth then divine principles of how God deals with mankind and specifically with the church. It does so usually without regarding the specific events in the book as having a future fulfillment, right? So the preterist position doesn't really look to the future for some of the things described in Revelation to be fulfilled in some kind of literal fashion. It sees all of that as symbolic in one way or another. All right, the next one is the historical position. You can see that one there. And we talked a little bit about this last week. In the historical position, it sees the churches here as representing a broad panorama of church history. So that we kind of move from one church that represents a certain period of church history to another church that represents the next, to another church that represents the next, et cetera, et cetera. This has given rise to what we call postmillennialism, postmillennial interpretation of Bible prophecy. We're going to talk more about that when we get to that section. And that was favored by Martin Luther, and there's actually quite a few others of the reformers during that time that favored this position. Again, in this view, there's a tendency to see the fulfillment of prophecy as occurring in one's own generation. So if you took a post-millennial position, say in the time of Martin Luther, you might have seen yourself as being the Church of Philadelphia then. Everybody understand that? The implications of that. And so with each successive generation, there's always been this tendency to place yourself into one of those churches, and quite frequently, I think, probably the Philadelphian church. And then the next view we talked about was the futurist view, and this is the dominant view in the early church, the earliest church, and of conservative scholars, Bible interpreters today. It ties in with what we call premillennialism. Again, we'll get to that in a little bit. And chapters 4 through 22 of Revelation then are seen as being yet future, even from our time, basically, chapters 4 through 22, and they'll be fulfilled in some kind of basically literal sense, all right? And one of the main objections to this view is that the highly symbolic language of the book, which futurists place a lot of emphasis on, must be reduced to a more literal interpretation. That's one of the critiques that's brought against it, okay? And if you're going to be a premillennialist in your interpretation, that's something to deal with. It is a book of symbols, okay? And how do we deal with them if we're going to claim that we're going to follow a literal approach to interpretation? And I also want to explain the word literal here, okay? By literal, we're talking about the historical grammatical method of interpreting the Bible, okay? The historical grammatical method of interpreting the Bible basically says that we understand the Bible as being written in human language, and it utilizes the basic rules of human language to communicate divine truth, right? And that's primarily the method of interpretation that we follow here in this church, okay? Any questions about that before I move on? Everybody perfectly clear, right? Okay, all right. We'll see. The reason why I'm bringing this out is because it has a bearing on what we do with verse 10. Okay? Yes, George.
I don't know if this is too much of a rabbit trail, or just a question of, are you going to get into how this historical view lent itself to post-millennialism, and how the conservative or the futuristic view lent itself to pre-millennialism?
Okay, there'll be some points. Yeah, George is asking, how do these connect? Yeah. I'll have some points later on, if you'll hold on to that thought, okay? Getting back then to some of the aspects of the text here, okay? All right, I'm just going to leave that up as it is for a while. All right. So in verse 7, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write, he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one shut, and who shuts and no one will open, says this, okay? And that's a reference to the person of Christ. And we identified 5 features that are brought out about Jesus in this verse. He is, and 2 of them are adjectival, and 3 of them are participles in the Greek, if that means anything to you. But what it all comes out is that he is the Holy One, he is the True One, he is the one who is holding the key of David, and because he is holding the key of David, he alone has the authority, he has the right to be the one who is opening and also the one who is shutting. Okay? So those are the 5 characteristics about Christ that come out in this verse. He has authority, he has power both in heaven and on earth and even over hell. We talked a little bit about the key of David and how that alludes to a passage that we studied in the book of Isaiah, how there is this one court official named Shebna. In Isaiah, apparently this Shebna who has the keys to the family, we'll call it the family fortune of Hezekiah, right? And this Shebna has access to that, and he's the one who can open those reserves and dole it out and also shut the doors and keep other people from getting into it. And my guess is that he kind of capitalizes on his own authority and probably misappropriates funds from that to build his own tomb before he's even dead, of course. And he wants this tomb built, I guess, to honor himself. The long story short, he winds up being demoted. Because of that, another person named Eliakim is appointed to take his place. And so this key of David is possibly a reference all the way back into the book of Isaiah in regards to that. All right. Verse 8, I know your deeds. Behold, I put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power and have kept my word and have not denied my name. All right? And here I see that The idea of Jesus having that key of David is he picks up on that. He continues with that. I know your deeds. Jesus is speaking here. I know what you people in this church have done. I know what you have faced. I know you have kept my name faithfully. And he says, I put an open door. See, he's used that key of authority. Jesus has used the key of authority to open a door for them. Now, it's never stated here what that door is. And so we had some discussion about that last week. I don't see Mary Ann anywhere. Oh, hiding back there. So I know I'm supposed to defer to my elders, but I'm going to stick to my position that the open door here is probably a door of opportunity in the gospel of some kind. But we admit it's not spelled out here. Okay, all we know is that Jesus has the key to that, and he's opened that door for them. Right? And so he's put this open door before them. No one can shut that. I think that kind of looks a little bit forward to the possibility. We know that they're being persecuted by members of the Jewish synagogue in Philadelphia. And that these Jewish members of that synagogue are taking apparently every opportunity they have to bring persecution against this church. And that might appear, if you're a believer in that church, it might appear, because of that persecution, that a door is being closed, okay? And Jesus is telling them, I'm the one with the key. I opened that door, and that door is going to stay open, okay? So I put an open door before you, and no one can shut it. You may think, next phrase there, I'm going to paraphrase here, because you have a little power, they're probably thinking we're small in numbers, we're small in influence here, we're probably not wealthy, we probably don't have much say in what happens in this city, okay? We have a little power. How can we resist this persecution? It looks like to us this door is shutting, but Jesus is assuring them because they have kept his word, they have not denied his name. Jesus is keeping that door open for them, that door of opportunity. So he says in verse 9, behold, I will cause those then of the synagogue of Satan. These are the ones that are persecuting the believers, who say that they're Jews and are not, but they lie. I make them, that's a very direct condemnation, isn't it? Yeah. We can make some application from that, I guess. People take this concept of don't judge others, and use that in implying that there should not be any discernment on your part or our part or something like that about morality, moral issues. Here Jesus is making a very definitive pronouncement about these people who call themselves Jews that are associated with the synagogue there. Sounds rather judgmental to me, okay? But he is Jesus. He can make this judgment. He knows their real motives. I will make them come and bow down at your feet. And the idea here is to prostrate themselves, wrong word, prostrate themselves before them. In other words, this is doing homage. This is a promise that these Jews at some point are going to recognize that the truth lays with those believers of this church in Philadelphia, and that they are right in worshiping Jesus as the Messiah of their own scriptures. And I'll make them. I forgot to do one thing. Anybody have an NIV here? Okay. Diane, could you read that NIV verse for us, please? I'll give you the microphone for a sec. Here, I'll hold it. You read.
Okay. So, verse 10, if I can find it. Since you have kept my command to endure patiently, I will also keep you from the hour of trial that is going to come upon the whole earth to test those who live on the earth.
Okay. Not much difference there, right? Does anybody have another version that seems to differ more from that? Okay, all right. Well, the questions come up here about how to translate a couple of key words. And that would be the word keep. I'm working with New American Standard here. The word keep and the word from, right? And I asked you earlier as we started this study to put yourself in the shoes of these people at this time. And this letter, this entire letter has been delivered to them. And we read on in the verse, to keep you from the hour of testing, and that hour which is about to come upon what? The whole world, all right, to test those who dwell on the earth, to try, to test, it's trial, okay? What's being referred to there? If you had just received this letter, what are you going to think? You're going to think chapters 4 to the end of the book, right? Okay? Everything that's laid out there, right? That's a period of trial and testing and everything that's about to come. I would say it would be natural for them to take the promise in that context. And the other word would be the word from. Okay? How would you take that? I'm going to keep you from. You're not going to go through it. Okay? And that really is, I think, the most natural way in the original language to take this. Right? But I gave you some interesting statistics here about that. The word there that's translated keep can mean variously to keep watch over, guard, hold, protect, preserved unharmed. Now, by itself, that could imply that maybe these believers would go through that, but somehow or other they would get through it unscathed. Right? But then you throw in the little preposition in the Greek that's translated from. So I gave you some stats on that. In the book of Revelation, within the book of Revelation, that preposition, ek, is translated of 44 times. Well, of wouldn't make sense here. Okay? If you substitute the word of, doesn't fit in. But it's translated from 9. I think my battery went dead. Got anything? Let's grab a spare back there. It's showing a red light on here. Thank you. And we're off again and running. Okay. The basic idea of this preposition is the idea of separation, separating someone from a group or from an individual, or separation from a situation or a circumstance. Right? So taking that along with this word for keep, again, I think it bolsters the idea that what's being promised here is that they're separated from this time of testing, out of, okay? So let's see, I got some points here. What all can we surmise from what's promised here, right? What can we observe here? Number one, the guarding or keeping out of is future, right? Secondly, it involves this time of testing that's about to come is a time period, right? Specific time period represented by the word hour. And that hour is a time of testing and trial. That hour is described as something imminent because in verse 11, Jesus says, I'm coming quickly. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's imminent. And the testing, the trial, extends to what? The entire world. Okay? So it's an hour of testing intended for everyone dwelling on the earth. In the context of this letter that was delivered then, what is that time period? What do we call that? The time of tribulation. Yeah. And that's described starting It really begins in chapter 6, because chapters 4 and 5 are the heavenly throne room scene that kind of sets all this up. So that time of tribulation begins to be described in chapter 6. Paul.
Just some context, and I'm thinking about what you're saying in Matthew 24. Jesus says in it, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to the whole world, testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And that what is that end, and does it relate to this hour?
Okay. And you have that's called the Olivet Discourse. And it's a good question. We don't obviously have time to go over the whole thing, all right? It's not only in Matthew, it's also over in Luke. Same discourse with a little bit of different emphasis. Sharon, you got a question?
Well, I think I'm following, but I think if they were encapsulated to where they weren't in touch with the outside world, they might think that this is all about them and this is going to happen. Like even in the Dust Bowl days, those people in the Dust Bowl thought that was the end of the world,
Yeah,
and they couldn't see past that.
right.
But they're not encapsulated, they are in touch with cities and churches and stuff around them, and I think, I'm hoping they see this as the future, and something you said off, and I'm not sure how to, but it seems like if Revelation would be two different books, if you wanted to separate the message to the churches from the description of what's going to happen. And it's not. It's all one book.
That was precisely my point. You got it, okay? It's all one book. And so when the church of Philadelphia is reading about themselves here in 7 through 13, attached to that is the rest of the book, right? Paul's short answer to your question, Olivet Discourse, right? Let's see, how short can I make this? Basically, in this fellowship, we would take the position that the Olivet Discourse primarily is describing what's going to happen still out in the future. All right, it hasn't been fulfilled yet. Now, preterists would probably argue that it was fulfilled back in the Roman time, especially back with the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, and that's why I explained these different positions to you, and it helps us understand why different Christians, different Christian groups look at some of these passages in a very different way, right? All right, let's keep going here. So, the promise then appears to be one of deliverance from or out of that time of trial that's to come upon the whole earth. And if you were one of the people receiving that, you'd probably be thinking, oh, what you describe in the rest of this letter. You're going to say, if that's going to happen real soon here, you're promising to keep us out of that. All right? They're promised not to just be kept from the trial or through the trial, but out of it. Okay? Out from the time and place of that trial. Now, so if you go to the next page in the notes there, some would attempt to say, well, this was fulfilled either close to their time or within the next few centuries because of some of the various Roman persecutions. So I gave you a list there of some of the major Roman persecutions that occurred either at the time this letter was written or following over the next couple of centuries. And of those, the one that would be closest to them in the future from their time would have been the persecution under Marcus Aurelius from about 161 to 180 AD. Let's see, most of these persecutions that are listed here were not empire-wide, and so it's difficult to see how any of them would have fulfilled these prophecies in the remainder of the book on any kind of literal type of basis. So you would have to resort to taking these persecutions on a more symbolic level rather than a more literalist level. Okay? So then I ask the question here, does this look forward to the church at the time of what we call the rapture? My answer in short is yes, it could. But we're going to skip over the rest of what I have there because I want to get to the end of the passage first, and then we'll loop back to this, okay? So let's keep going here. Verse 11, Jesus says, I'm coming quickly. I'm coming quickly. Doesn't necessarily, the word that's used there doesn't necessarily mean right now, but it does mean suddenly, unexpectedly. When I come, people aren't going to be ready for it. So as you see there, my notes there, when Jesus appears for his church, it will be with little or no warning whatsoever. There won't be a time to suddenly clean up your act, repent, do some good deeds, make yourself more presentable, accomplish something worthwhile, complete the bucket list. Get more oil for your lamp, okay? It's going to be sudden. That's what he's promising. And so there's an exhortation attached to that. And the he exhorts them, I'm coming quickly. So you Philadelphians, you've already been faithful. You've held on to my name faithfully and fast to what you have so that no one will take away your crown. Not a crown of salvation, but a crown of reward of some kind. Crowns can be lost and won, apparently, when we look at the various crowns in Scripture. All right? Verse 12, he who overcomes. And Ed, you brought up good verse here, 1 John, right? About how do we overcome? How do believers overcome?
1 John 5:5.
Read it for us. You don't have it memorized? Come on.
But not on the spot.
Okay.
Who is the one who overcomes the world? But he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God.
Okay. He who believes, he puts their trust in Jesus Christ, who is the Son of God. That's the basic means of our overcoming everything that the world throws at us. Paul? Yes, yeah. Good way of looking at it. He's the one who overcomes. We're just on his coattails. All right, so he who overcomes, I'll make him a pillar in the temple of my God. We've shown them before here some of the temples dedicated to the various deities that existed in the world at this time. And most of those temples architecturally were based on columns or pillars. The basic structure were columns and pillars that would then support a roof structure, and then within that they'd build rooms and whatever they needed in that pagan temple. And sometimes those pillars then would be dedicated to, say, an official or a magistrate of the city, or somebody who had something to do with getting that temple built, all right? You know, we have similar things that happen today with a church does a church fundraising thing, and if you donate enough money, this pew will have a little plaque on it dedicated to the memory of so-and-so, or you get the idea, okay? But this is much more important because the pillar is a very strong structure, right? It's the main support of the building. And so Jesus is here making them a promise. You're going to be a temple, or a pillar in the temple of my God. And he will not, that believer will not go out from it anymore. And then there's three other things that are promised here. I'll write on him the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, that's explained, right? And which comes down out of heaven from my God, and my new name. So you see the three things there, okay? I'll write on him the name of my God, the name of the city of my God, and my own, Jesus, my own new name, which we don't know exactly what that is, right? But all of that I take as, well, you know, I'm not sure how literal to take that. Later on, we find out in the book that those who refuse to take the mark of the beast, right, they are some of the saints that come through the tribulation period because during that tribulation period, the gospel's still being preached. Some people will believe that, okay? And they'll refuse to get the mark of the beast, okay? And there's special rewards for them, and a lot of them are martyred during that tribulation period. Final exhortation here. He who has an ear. If you have an ear that can hear and understand, then listen up to what the Spirit is saying. And there's one thing here I want to point out that hadn't been pointed out before, I think, and that is the word churches is in the plural, right? So in other words, don't listen to just what I'm saying to you, believers in Philadelphia. You have the entire letter. Learn from what I'm saying to all of the churches, right? Take application from all of that. Be careful not to lose your first love. Be careful not to be deluded by the false teaching of the Nicolaitans, all right? You see what I'm getting at, okay? All right. Any questions or points to bring up at this point here? Anybody? All right, so in the remaining few minutes, here we go again. I want to show you a few things here. Okay, so when it comes to interpreting Bible prophecy, there are three main prophetic views within the church. The first one is called amillennialism, and that's what I put up on the background chart there. Oh, it's not on? What happened? Should I hit it again? It says, okay. All right. Yeah, I'm looking. Are you needing to do something back there? I guess we already lost Joshua. There's the files are like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and they all say something about Church of Philadelphia.
Your one on amillennialism doesn't want to come up.
Okay.
There's a reason for that.
All right. But what's the reason? Okay. Yeah, I don't see them here at all anymore, unless they're way down. Okay.
Go ahead and talk about it real quick.
Okay.
And then I'll advance it to the next one.
Okay. Amillennialism basically takes Scripture, and especially prophetic Scripture, and spiritualizes the interpretation of it. They don't take it in a literal sense. The Old Testament promises to Israel are seen as being spiritually fulfilled in the church. The millennium is not really a literal 1,000-year period. Since it's only found specifically in Revelation 20, and since Revelation is a book of signs and symbols, they believe in not taking the millennium literally, but as symbolic. And the millennium, in their view, includes the present time from the resurrection of Christ all the way up to his second coming. During that time, Christ is reigning in heaven with the disembodied spirits of believers. They don't see the kingdom as being in any way earthly or political, but strictly spiritual and heavenly. And during this non-literal millennium, Satan is being bound during the present age as the gospel is being proclaimed. They don't see any future earthly kingdom for Israel. And they see that the Great Tribulation occurs just before the return of Christ. Okay? All right, let's try postmillennialism. There it is. All right. Okay. So in postmillennialism, Christ returns at the end of a millennial era, which is a period of the successful spread of the gospel. Some postmillennialists take the millennium as a literal 1,000-year period. Others don't, all right? But basically, they see the millennium as a golden age previous to Christ's second advent or his return, during which, as the gospel is preached, virtually the entire world is sees an unprecedented spread of the gospel and unprecedented conversions to Christ. So it's a very optimistic view, right? They see the kingdom then as being extended by the preaching of the gospel and the ordinances, the use of the ordinances of the church. They see Satan as being bound, but progressively bound as the gospel is being preached. And that the outcome of this is the world is virtually Christianized by the time Jesus comes back. There's no fulfilling of promises made to the Jewish nation. There's nothing literal about that. In fact, Luther and some of the other early reformers saw the view that that the nation of Israel would be restored. They saw that as heretical. And again, Christ returns at the end of the period of a great tribulation that occurs just before Jesus comes back. Then lastly, there's premillennialism, okay? And that means that the second coming of Christ precedes the millennium period. Premillennialists take that as pretty much a literal 1,000-year reign, personal reign of Christ, where the messianic kingdom is fulfilled, which is a theocratic kingdom on earth. They see the rapture as occurring as proceeding before Christ's coming back, right? But there's four different views as to when that rapture is going to occur. So the kingdom has an earthly, literal, and political sense, as well as a heavenly sense. And they see the national promises to Israel remain in effect and must be fulfilled by that nation. Okay? So if that's true, then you can't take promises made to Israel and apply them to the church directly. It sets up a hermeneutic, if you will, of distinction between Israel and the church. Right? Satan is bound during the millennial period, but according to Revelation, towards the end of that period, he's released for a short time. He apparently gathers Gog and Magog again for one final rebellion against Christ and his rule in the millennial reign, at the end of that millennial reign. And before the millennium is when you have the Great Tribulation period, which is identified as a 7-year period, often called Daniel's 70th week. Now, I dumped a whole lot on you here, all right? I mentioned within premillennialism, then there's the question of the rapture. What is the rapture? When does it occur? Some people then associate the rapture with verse 10 here in chapter 3. They ask the question, well, how is God, if these believers were to be kept out of the Great Tribulation, how would God do that? How would he keep them out? And the answer might be he'll rapture them out on the basis of the book of 1 Thessalonians. Some of the information is 2 Thessalonians and also 1 Corinthians 15. Again, this is all overview, so I can't answer all the questions that I'm sure are coming up here. All right. So the four views of the rapture. All right. Do we have anything left? Do I have the views of rapture back there, Charles? Okay. So post-tribulation rapture, and you can see in this diagram here that the rapture occurs just before, it occurs at the end of the Great Tribulation period and just before Jesus returns in what we call the second advent. So in this view, the rapture is essentially the same as the second advent. And that's the post-tribulation view. All right? Then we have, the next one I don't have a diagram for, Charles, the pre-wrath rapture. Puts the rapture a little further back on that timeline. So right now you're seeing the mid-tribulation rapture, and you see that arrow where it says Great Tribulation, and the pre-wrath rapture puts the rapture about where you see the tip of that arrow. Okay? It says the church goes through some of the tribulation period, but it doesn't go through the period in which God's wrath is being poured out. And so they make a distinction. The first part of the tribulation is when Satan's wrath is being poured out, and the last part of the tribulation is when God's wrath is being poured out. All right? And that's becoming, it seems to be emerging as a fairly popular view. Then there's a mid-tribulation view, pushes it back a little bit further, probably close to the time in which the Antichrist desecrates the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And then that's kind of like when, that's when the Antichrist really displays himself for who he really is. Okay? And then the pre-tribulation view. Got that one, Charles? Okay. Pre-tribulation then, the rapture occurs before the beginning of Daniel's 70th week, the week of trial and testing and tribulation. It begins before the period of great tribulation and a full 7 years before the second advent of Christ. And that's generally the position that this church has taken. Okay? Yeah. If you've read the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye, that's basically the position that he's putting out there. Right? So, Ed.
I was just going to say a caution. 2,000 years ago, there was a lot of prophecy about the coming of Christ. And we know that a lot of people were looking very closely at those prophecies and coming up with stories of how it was going to happen. And I would say every one of them got it wrong.
Okay.
The disciples got it wrong. The Pharisees got it wrong. The king got it wrong. The wise men got it wrong. Who got it right?
Yeah.
The shepherds got it right.
Okay.
So I would caution us so prophecies can only be fully understood, I would argue, in retrospect.
Yeah.
We have clues
If you're the generation,
about how we interpret them and how we choose to live our lives today with them.
yeah. If you're in the generation in which they're being fulfilled, then they'll all make sense. Okay? Because you either after or during. But yeah. And so Ed makes a good point here. Yeah, Mary Ann?
But even though we don't know exactly, in our, that's right, be prepared.
Be prepared, yes. Okay? Regardless of which view, be prepared. Be faithful. Isn't that the message here? Okay? And one other thing, whether it's premillennial, postmillennial, or amillennial, all three have one thing in common. Jesus comes back. Okay?
And he will keep you from the hour of testing. We don't have to know the details of that. We just need to know that he will keep us from the hour of testing in whatever ways. And the testing is going, we will have earthly testing. We will be going through persecution.
We go through persecutions, yes. Okay. But the hour of testing for the whole world, all right. So my final answer for verse 10, I see application, but I also have reservation because this was made to people 2,000 years ago. They're not even around anymore, okay? So I'm a little reserved in trying to build my doctrine on verse 10. I'd rather build it on what I see in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and 1 Corinthians 15. Those are clearer passages to support that pre-tribulational idea. Okay? All right, we got to close. Thank you, Father. Again, I appreciate the input of the class here. And may we all take to heart the exhortation and the basic thing that we see here. You are returning. You're coming back. We are accountable to you, and we are exhorted to hold faithful to your name. And I pray that everyone here would be faithful in doing so. And we ask this in the name of our Savior, who has the power, who has the ability to keep us faithful. We ask